a group of urban explorers ventured into the abandoned hospital, laughing off the stories of a ghostly nurse who still roamed its halls. As they snapped photos in the dimly lit corridors, they noticed a woman in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform standing behind them in a mirror's reflection. Yet, when they turned around, she was nowhere to be found, and the reflection kept staring. In the summer of 1982, a group of urban explorers set their sights on the infamous abandoned hospital on the outskirts of Manila, a once grand establishment that had long been relegated to whispers and local legend. The building, with its sagging roof, shattered windows, and overgrown courtyards, stood as a monument to forgotten lives and unsolved mysteries. Despite the rumors that a ghostly nurse roamed its empty halls, the group, youthful and defiant, were eager to document their adventure, armed with cameras, flashlights, and an insatiable curiosity about the past. The group consisted of 5 friends. Marco, the unofficial leader, known for his fearless attitude and quick wit. Liza, whose passion for photography was matched only by her keen eye for detail. Ramon, a quiet and thoughtful soul with an interest in history. Bella, whose humor often masked her underlying anxiety. And June, the skeptic of the group, whose rationality clashed with the supernatural tales they were about to encounter. Their plan was simple: enter the hospital at dusk, explore its winding corridors, capture eerie images, and leave before nightfall if nothing inexplicable happened. As they approached the hospital, the fading light of dusk cast long, distorted shadows on the building's cracked facade. The grand entrance, once a symbol of hope and healing, now appeared as a foreboding gateway to another world. Marco led the way, pushing aside a rusted gate that groaned in protest, its sound swallowed by the encroaching darkness. The group's laughter and banter masked an undercurrent of unease. Even the most skeptical among them felt a chill as they stepped into the abandoned lobby. Inside, the remnants of the hospital's past lay scattered like fragments of a forgotten dream. Cracked tiles, peeling paint, and remnants of old signage hinted at a time when the corridors bustled with activity. The air was heavy with dust and decay, a tangible reminder of the passage of time. Liza's camera flashed intermittently as she documented every nook and cranny, her excited chatter mingling with the echo of their footsteps. Ramon paused frequently to trace his fingers along old, rusted doorknobs and faded plaques, pondering the lives that had once passed through these halls. Bella, usually the most cheerful of the group, found herself glancing nervously over her shoulder, as if expecting the unseen to materialize from the shadows. It wasn't long before the group reached what was once the central corridor of the hospital. The corridor stretched before them, lined with closed patient rooms whose doors hung slightly ajar, revealing vague silhouettes of beds and broken furniture. Their flashlights illuminated ghostly images on the walls, faded murals, and peeling wallpaper that hinted at happier times. As they ventured deeper, the playful banter gradually gave way to a tense silence, each step echoing like a heartbeat in the cavernous space. At the far end of the corridor, behind a heavy weathered door, lay the old nurse's station. Intrigued, Marco suggested they start there, expecting to find remnants of medical records and perhaps even personal effects of the hospital staff. When they pushed the door open, a cloud of dust billowed out, and the dim light revealed a room frozen in time. An old wooden desk cluttered with yellowed papers, antique filing cabinets, and a solitary mirror hanging on the wall. It was in that mirror that their first encounter with the legend occurred. Liza, ever the photographer, was drawn to the mirror's reflective surface. She positioned herself in front of it, snapping photos of the room. At first, the mirror simply captured their images, a group of friends illuminated by the weak beam of a flashlight. But as they reviewed the images on Liza's camera, a strange detail emerged. In the reflection, behind the group, stood a figure, a woman, in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform. Her white dress was immaculate, her cap perfectly aligned on her head, and her eyes, dark and hollow, fixed intently on the explorers. The image was chilling, and when Liza turned to point out the figure, the corridor behind them was empty. "Did you see that?" Liza whispered, her voice trembling as she replayed the photo. The others crowded around the camera screen, their eyes widening in disbelief. June scoffed at the image, insisting it was a trick of the light or a stray reflection. But Marco's face was etched with concern, and even Bella's usual humor was replaced by an unspoken dread. Deciding to press on despite the unsettling discovery, the group left the nurse's station and began to explore the hospital's maze-like layout. Their path took them through winding corridors, past abandoned patient rooms filled with remnants of personal belongings, a child's toy here, a faded photograph there. Each room seemed to whisper stories of despair and hope long lost, and the group could not help but feel that they were trespassing on sacred ground. In one room, Ramon found an old logbook, its pages filled with handwritten notes that chronicled the daily lives of the hospital staff. Among the mundane entries were cryptic remarks about the nurse who never left, a figure described as ever present, her eyes filled with sorrow and duty. The notes spoke of a nurse who had vanished under mysterious circumstances decades earlier, only to be seen wandering the halls, still tending to patients who no longer existed. The logbook hinted that she had been a beloved figure during her lifetime, known for her compassion and relentless work ethic, a nurse who had given everything to her patients, and perhaps in death, had become bound to the hospital itself. As the explorers absorbed the eerie lore, the hospital seemed to respond. The lights in the corridor flickered erratically, and a sudden draft of cold air swept through the hall, carrying with it the faint sound of a distant melodic lullaby, soft and melancholic, echoing through the empty rooms. Bella shivered, her eyes darting around, as if expecting to see the spectral nurse appear at any moment. Marco suggested they split into smaller groups to cover more ground, though the idea only heightened their anxiety. June and Liza ventured down one corridor, while Marco, Ramon, and Bella took another. The division of the group allowed each pair to experience the oppressive atmosphere in a more intimate way. June, ever the skeptic, insisted on rational explanations for every creak and groan of the building. "It's just the wind and old pipes," he explained repeatedly, though even his voice wavered as they turned a corner and found themselves in a long, dark passageway lined with empty beds. Meanwhile, in the corridor with June and Liza, the sense of being watched grew stronger. The pair's flashlights darted across the walls, capturing fleeting images of Movementador that swung open on its own, a shadow that slithered away just as quickly as it appeared. Liza's camera was constantly at the ready, capturing every anomaly. Then, without warning, they heard a soft rustling behind them. June spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but nothing was there. Yet on the wall behind them, a reflection in a tarnished metal panel revealed the unmistakable outline of a woman in a nurse's uniform. Her presence was static and unnerving, as if she were trapped in time, her gaze locked on the intruders. In that moment, Liza's hand shook so violently that she dropped her camera. The clatter of the falling device seemed deafening in the quiet corridor. Jun reached out to help her, and as their eyes met, they both saw the reflection in the metal panel, now clearer than ever. The nurse's face was pale and sorrowful, her eyes seeming to follow their every move. June's rational mind rebelled at the sight, insisting it was an optical illusion. But Liza's voice, barely a whisper, pleaded, "She's here. She never left." Meanwhile, back with Marco, Ramon, and Bella, the trio explored a series of interconnected rooms that once served as operating theaters. The walls were adorned with peeling charts and faded photographs, and the silence was punctuated by the distant drip of water and the low hum of old machinery. As they moved through the space, Bella began to feel an inexplicable heaviness. as if an unseen presence was drawing near. Ramon, who had taken a keen interest in the building's history, recounted the tragic tale of the nurse from the logbook. Her name was Maria, a compassionate caregiver who had vanished under mysterious circumstances after the hospital was forced to close one of its wings due to a series of inexplicable accidents. According to the records, Maria had been seen wandering the halls even after her death, a spectral figure who continued to tend to the needs of those long gone. Their conversation was cut short by a sudden, sharp sound of metallic clatter that echoed through the sterile halls. Marco rushed to a nearby window, but all he saw was his own reflection distorted by grime. However, when he looked back at his companions, he noticed something chilling. In the darkened reflection of a polished metal tray, the ghostly image of a nurse in a pristine uniform stood behind them. The figure's eyes were fixed on them, unblinking and mournful. Marco's heart pounded, and he called out, "Did you see that?" But when they turned, there was nothing but empty space. The eerie encounters escalated as the night wore on. The group reconvened in a central atrium, a vast hall with a high, crumbling ceiling and scattered remnants of what once might have been a place of healing. There, under the cold light of a single overhead lamp that miraculously still flickered, they gathered to share their experiences. Each of them had seen something haunting: gaze in a mirror, the persistent presence in a metal panel, the spectral figure in the reflection of a tray. The common thread in all their stories was unmistakable: the nurse who never left. Determined to uncover the truth behind these inexplicable events, the group agreed to split up once more. Their plan was to document every possible angle of the phenomenon, hoping that together their evidence would piece together the story of Maria, the ghostly nurse. Liza and June headed back to the corridor where the reflections had first appeared, while Marco, Ramon, and Bella returned to the nurse's station to search for more clues in the old records and personal effects left behind by the hospital staff. Liza and Jun, armed with cameras and recorders, retraced their steps. The corridor, now bathed in a dim, almost ethereal light from a stray beam of moonlight piercing through a broken window, seemed to pulse with a life of its own. As they paused to take another set of photographs, Liza noticed the mirror-like surface of an old, dented metal cabinet. In its reflection, she caught a glimpse of the nurse again. This time, the image was unmistakably a spectral woman in a vintage nurse's uniform, her expression one of deep sorrow and longing. Her eyes locked onto Liza's with a haunting intensity that sent shivers down her spine. Before Liza could react, the image shifted. The nurse's head tilted slightly as if studying them, and then the reflection faded, leaving only the empty corridor behind. Back at the nurse's station, Marco, Ramon, and Bella scoured through filing cabinets and dusty ledgers. In a tattered diary bound in cracked leather, they found a series of entries dated back to the late 1940s. The diary belonged to a nurse named Maria, whose heartfelt entries spoke of long nights, tending to the sick, and her unwavering commitment to her patients. However, as the pages turned, the tone shifted abruptly. Maria wrote of a strange occurrence a night when a patient had vanished, and she had heard a whispering voice urging her to remain in the hospital, to never leave. The final entry was the most disturbing. "I have seen the light fade, and with it, I am bound here forever. I am the nurse who never left." The chilling confession sent a wave of cold dread through Marco, Ramon, and Bella. It was as if Maria's very soul had been captured in ink and paper, her fate sealed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. Their discovery prompted the trio to search the building for any remnants of Maria's personal belongings, a name tag perhaps, or a photograph that might provide further insight into her tragic end. In a forgotten corner of the station, hidden under layers of dust and neglect, Bella uncovered an old, rusted name tag, emblazoned with the name Maria. The tag, though corroded by time, still bore an inscription that read, "In service to those in need." It was a silent testament to a life dedicated to caring for others, now reduced to a relic of sorrow and loss. As the night deepened, the paranormal occurrences intensified. Both groups began to experience a sense of being enveloped by an unseen presence, a weight that pressed down on their chests, making it difficult to breathe. The halls of the hospital seemed to close in around them, and the boundary between reality and the spectral realm blurred with every passing moment. Whispers echoed softly through the corridors, indistinct voices murmuring words that none could decipher. At times, the air itself seemed to shimmer with the residue of lost souls. Liza, unable to shake the image of the nurse's relentless gaze, found herself drawn to a particular room at the end of the corridor, a small, confined space that had once served as a storage closet for old linens. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and inside, amidst piles of moth-eaten fabrics, she discovered an assortment of personal items. A faded photograph of a young nurse smiling gently, a delicate silver locket, and a handwritten note that read, "I will watch over you, always." The note was signed simply with the initial M. Overwhelmed by emotion, Liza felt as though the nurse was reaching out to her, desperate to be remembered and freed from her eternal vigil. Jun, who had maintained his skeptical facade throughout the night, found himself grappling with doubts as the evidence mounted. The rational explanations he clung to, reflections, trickery of light, and mere coincidences began to crumble in the face of the palpable presence and the personal artifacts that bore Maria's mark. In a moment of rare vulnerability, he confided in Liza, "Maybe there's more to these stories than we thought. Perhaps she is still here, bound to this place by a promise or a curse." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden, spine-chilling sound, a slow, deliberate tapping that seemed to come from the very walls. Both Liza and June froze, their eyes searching the darkness for the source. In the mirror of a nearby cabinet, they saw it again. The nurse standing perfectly still, her eyes unblinking and her face etched with a sadness that transcended time. The apparition seemed to linger, as if unwilling to let go, her presence a silent plea for recognition. The sight was so profound that for a moment, the two explorers forgot to capture it with their cameras. They simply stared, transfixed by the spectral image that refused to vanish. Meanwhile, Marco, Ramon, and Bella, deep in their investigation of the nurse's station, began to notice peculiar phenomena of their own. The old radio that had been left on a dusty shelf suddenly crackled to life, emitting a faint broadcast that mimicked the static of a distant emergency signal. The sound was interspersed with a voice, a woman's voice, soft and melodic, yet laden with an undercurrent of despair. "I am here. I never left." The voice whispered repeatedly, as if caught in an endless loop. The trio exchanged uneasy glances, each of them feeling an inexplicable connection to the voice that seemed to echo from the very soul of the building. Ramon, whose interest in the hospital's tragic history had grown into a near-obsessive quest for truth, felt a surge of determination. "We need to document this," he insisted. "Every piece of evidence might help us understand what happened to her and why she is still here." Marco nodded in agreement, his earlier bravado replaced by a solemn resolve. Even Bella, who had been visibly shaken by the revelations in the nurse's station, agreed that the truth must be unearthed, no matter how dark it might be. The hours slipped by in a disorienting blur of spectral encounters, whispered confessions from the past, and the mounting terror of an unseen presence. The hospital itself seemed to come alive with memories, its every creak and groan a lament for the souls it had claimed. The group reconvened in the central atrium, their faces etched with exhaustion and disbelief. They gathered around a makeshift display of the items they had collected: faded photograph of Maria, the rusted name tag, and fragments of the diary. In that moment, the legend of the nurse took on a personal, almost tangible form. Each of them felt the weight of her sorrow, the sense that Maria's spirit was not a vengeful force, but rather a tormented soul trapped by circumstances beyond her control. As dawn approached, the oppressive atmosphere began to lift, though the memory of the night's events remained seared into their minds. The group made their way to the exit, leaving behind the haunted corridors and echoing halls of the abandoned hospital. They emerged into the cool light of early morning, the urban landscape of Manila, coming back into focus, a stark contrast to the spectral realm they had just left. Yet even as they parted ways and returned to their everyday lives, the image of the nurse in the mirror lingered in their thoughts. Her sad, unblinking eyes seemed to follow them, a constant reminder that some spirits never truly leave. In the weeks and months that followed, the urban explorers would recount their experiences to anyone willing to listen. Their photos, once dismissed as mere tricks of light, gradually gained credibility as the details of the ghostly nurse became a fixture in local lore. Marco compiled their evidence into a small zine, distributing it at local gatherings and urban exploration meetups. Liza's photographs, capturing the haunting reflection of Maria, became iconic images in the burgeoning subculture of abandoned places. Even John, the skeptic, found himself revisiting the hospital in his dreams, his disbelief replaced by an unspoken acknowledgement of forces that defied reason. For many in Manila, the story of the nurse who never left took on a life of its own, a cautionary tale for those who dared disturb the past. Locals claimed that on quiet, fog-laden nights, one could see a pale figure in a vintage nurse's uniform wandering the hospital ruins, her gaze both sorrowful and comforting. Some said she was searching for redemption, a way to finally rest after decades of wandering the halls of a place that had forgotten her sacrifice. Others believed she was a guardian, watching over the lost souls who once sought solace within the hospital's walls. As for the urban explorers, the experience forever altered their perception of reality. The nurse's silent, mournful vigil had shown them that some mysteries are not meant to be fully understood, that the boundaries between life and death are sometimes more porous than science would admit. And in the quiet moments of reflection, when the clamor of the city faded away, they could still feel her presence, as if she were a part of their own memories, a silent witness to the passage of time. The legend of Maria, the nurse who never left, continued to evolve with each retelling. Her story became a symbol of the many lives lost in the relentless march of time, a reminder that every forgotten soul has a story, and every story leaves an echo in the corridors of history. The abandoned hospital, with its crumbling walls and echoing halls, remained a place of pilgrimage for those seeking to connect with the past. And for those brave enough to venture into its depths, the ghostly nurse stood as both a warning and a beacon reminder that sometimes the greatest mysteries are the ones that reside in the spaces between light and shadow. Do you believe that Maria's spirit has finally found peace, or does she still wander the halls, forever bound to the legacy of a hospital that refused to let go? Share your thoughts, theories, and your own encounters with the inexplicable. The nurse who never left may be a ghost to some, but her story lives on, etched into the annals of urban legends and in the hearts of those who dared to look into the mirror and see beyond the veil of the ordinary.